the lands along the Bruce Trail. So the Niagara Escarpment. Niagara Escarpment, it's not a fault line, but the result of unequal erosion. The escarpment is the most prominent of several escarpments formed in the bedrock of the Great Lakes Basin. And from its easternmost point, just south of Lake Ontario, the escarpment shapes the part of the individual basins and landforms of Lake Ontario, Lake Huron, and Lake Michigan. And you can see it runs up and over and partially back down into the States. And this is the path that the Bruce Trail follows. So within the escarpment, there are different layers of rocks, and you can see them represented here. There's the Queenston Shale, which is at the bottom of the escarpment. We have the mixed beds and the Lockport Dolostone at the top. And we see much of this exposed along the Bruce Trail and the Niagara Escarpment. We have many caves and crevices that are formed through the natural erosion and freeze-thaw cycles that happen in Ontario and within Canada. And that continues to play a big part in shaping how the Niagara Escarpment looks today. And you can see we have flower pots that are left by erosion where the more harder rock is left and the softer rock has been eroded away. We follow beaches and shorelines and cliffs that soar above where you get the views over the water in the northern stretches of the Bruce Trail. We pass through two different forest zones. There's the deciduous forest and the Great Lakes forest. And these are both the Carolinian zone and the mixed forest zone. And I'll talk a little bit about the ecology that we find in these different zones. So the Carolinian life zone, there's more endangered and rare species here than in any other life zone in Canada. And less than 2% of this landscape is in public ownership. 73% of the landscape is in highly productive agriculture. Forest cover has been reduced from 80% to only 11.3%, and the forest interior is reduced to just 2%. Wetlands have gone from 28% to just 5%, and this is some of the most populated area within Canada. In Canada, we all live in one little part of the country, even though it's quite a big country. In the mixed forest zone, which is the second largest forest zone in Ontario, has 19% of the province's forests, and it covers about 20 million hectares. 38% of this forest region is privately owned. So this is a big part of our story, is this private ownership of the land. With the ecology, we have 325 bird species, or 72% of all birds recorded in Ontario are shown in the Niagara Escarpment area. And so preserving the land of the Niagara Escarpment is ecologically important for bird preservation. 55 mammal species and 34 species of reptiles and amphibians have been recorded, which include the American badger, the spiny soft-shelled turtle, the black bear, fishers, and Massasauga rattlesnakes. There are 1,500 plus species of vascular plants, including 40% of Ontario's rare flora and 50 different fern species. 44 of the 65 species of orchids in Ontario are found along the Niagara Escarpment, and the oldest trees in Canada east of the Rocky Mountains, the ancient white cedars, can be found clinging to the side of the Niagara Escarpment. Maidenhair spleenwort, marginal wood fern, the calypso orchid, the pink lady slipper, and the ancient white cedars are just some of the examples of these rare species that can be found along the Niagara Escarpment. We also have wetlands along the Niagara Escarpment, and they are the most productive and biologically diverse habitats on the planet. Ontario has an estimated 29 million hectares of wetlands, and this represents about 25% of the wetlands, or 6% of the Earth's wetlands, are found along the Niagara Escarpment. 70% of Southern Ontario wetlands have been converted to other uses. So what are we going to do about it? We can see there's a lot of pressure on this, ecologically important area. Here we go. So back in the 1960s, the idea of creating a public footpath spanning the Niagara Escarpment as a means of promoting its protection was born. Never before in the history of Canada had such a trail been realized. The four founders, who met through a local naturalist club, were instrumental in building the Bruce Trail. In 1961, an article was published in the Financial Post that said, "Can they save this ribbon of wilderness?" With development pressures mounting, the founders worked hard to establish a route for the Bruce Trail. The land that the Bruce Trail crosses is some of the most highly sought after spaces for development. So Philip Gosling, one of our founders, he took a leave of absence from his job to be the first trail director of the Bruce Trail, which was then called the Bruce Trail Association, and map out the route. Using handshake agreements, the trail was placed on public and private lands. And so wherever the trail crossed a private property, a deal or a handshake was made with that landowner. In 1962, we had the first hike of the Bruce Trail, and the idea of providing access to nature to have people fall in love with it and want to preserve it had come to fruition. Ray Lowes, one of our founders, wrote in 1963, "Here stands a rugged, beautiful continuum of rocks, waterfalls, greenery, recreational opportunity that must be preserved in its entirety for us and for the future. The Bruce Trail is the chain that at once binds this potential into a unified whole that brings the very existence of a unique resource sharply to the attention of population used to taking things for granted, that when it's built and being used, it will inspire a desire to protect and preserve from further encroachment a green belt across the province, which could be our pride in future years." However, this idea was not enough. To the shock of local residents, a giant gap appeared in the escarpment seemingly overnight. Clearly viewed from the local highway, an indelible scar and a beautiful landmark was clear to see, and you can see it there in that photo. This was a catalyst for calls for a measured approach to development, and a few important measures and legislations were put in place in those early days, which have contributed to today's conservation efforts. We have a Niagara Escarpment Plan and a UNESCO World Biosphere designation. However, legislation is not always enough. The Bruce Trail and the Niagara Escarpment are in some of the most densely populated areas of Canada, and the act of balancing land preservation and development pressures are very much part of the landscape of Ontario. While lands have been protected through the legislation that I referenced, lately that has not been enough to stop development, as governments can and have been moving lands out of the protected criteria to open them up for development. As development along the Niagara Escarpment increases, so does the risk of further fragmentation of the ecological landscape and loss of the conservation corridor that contains the Bruce Trail. This map shows the protected areas by legislation in Ontario. One is the Greenbelt that travels east to west, and the other is the Niagara Escarpment that goes north and south. However, much of this land is in private ownership. So what are we going to do about it? Again, in the 1980s, the Bruce Trail Conservancy's land securement program really began in earnest. The realization that land was becoming an increasingly valued asset among naturalists and citizens alike on the Niagara Escarpment shone a light on the precarious nature of a handshake agreement and legislation. We knew that if we didn't start securing the land permanently, it would be at risk of being lost forever. To date, the Bruce Trail Conservancy has protected 19,600 acres along the Niagara Escarpment, and the updated cost of securing the remaining properties is estimated at 100 million Canadian dollars, which I think is about 300 million reais, approximately, and increasing all the time as land prices go up. So the lands that we are conserving and buying and putting into permanent protection create a continuous conservation corridor that will be protected permanently. And this map shows the BTC lands that we've bought in brown, and other protected lands are shown there in green, and combined, they create that continuous ribbon of secured natural lands that then allow for the movement of wildlife and ecological diversity along the trail. So not only do we buy the lands, once we have the lands, then we go into our land stewardship program. Our staff go out to check the properties. They do a biophysical inventory of each property in each season to identify different plants and animals and the geology, the soil, the hydrology along that property. They look for species at risk. They look at the ecological communities, invasive species, cultural features, and any encroachment that is on that particular property. They prepare a plan, they assign a volunteer to the property, and then they initiate the project or recommendations from the land stewardship plan. And every 10 years, they go back and they look at the property again and make sure that the plan is being followed at least every 10 years, generally more often. Additionally, we have a landowner stewardship program. So this is focusing on assisting private landowners with stewardship between the islands of conservation, as we call them. So between our protected properties, which you can see here in the map, the protected properties are in brown, and then in between are the other properties. So we are offering to those landowners a chance to participate in conservation. We'll go out and visit their site. We will do a stewardship plan for them. We will offer them stewardship resources, and we will provide support for stewardship projects such as planting native species and removal of invasive species on their private land. And that way, we are creating more connection for nature. So nature-based solutions for land restoration is really one of our big things that we're doing on our properties that we're purchasing. And we are committed to employing these solutions to restore and enhance the biodiversity of the Niagara Escarpment. This year, we planted 4,000 trees on our Cape Chin property, which used to be a farm, but is being restored to be a forest. We're finding that balance between restoration and existing farming practices on other properties as well. Other initiatives that we're doing are tree and shrub plantings, wildflower and grass plantings, grassland restoration, bird boxes, bead boxes, and long-term breeding bird studies. Tallgrass Prairie is another restoration project that we're focused on recently. Tallgrass Prairie used to cover 1,000 kilometers in Ontario, and now it's just 30 square kilometers in 200 fragmented sites. The BTC is actively working to restore tallgrass prairie on our lands by planting seeds and performing controlled burns. This tallgrass prairie here is on one of our properties in Burlington and was just planted in the last few years. And we're planting more tallgrass prairie in other locations along the Bruce